Statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that the Secretary of the New South Wales Department of Education has written to the principal of every public school in New South Wales, stating the Commonwealth budget leaves, and I quote, a shortfall from our existing agreement of $1.8 billion? Is the Prime Minister aware the email also refers to information sent out by the Commonwealth Education Minister saying, and I quote, you should not rely on these figures for future planning or budgeting purposes?
The member for Sydney's time has concluded. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting and the Prime Minister has the floor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The honourable member will be aware that under the Quality Schools package that is part of this budget, schools in government schools in New South Wales will have total funding over 10 years of $31 billion, an 83% increase over 10 years in funding. And Mr Speaker,
the Minister for Energy and the Environment,
for the honourable member and her colleagues,
Minister for Energy
and
Environment,
do they actually have a schools policy at all? She says she has 27 contradictory and secret deals. Funny money, monopoly money. $22 billion she was not prepared to commit to only a few days ago. Now, what we have done is fully implement the Gonski recommendations of national, consistent, needs-based funding. Well, honourable members complain. Certainly David Gonski was there when we announced it. He endorsed it because he knows that what the Labor Party did was corrupt his recommendations. They did not deliver the model that he provided at all. And the reality is this, Mr Speaker. We are committing an additional $18.6 billion to schools over the decade. 75% increase right across the nation, across government, non-government schools. And we're bringing them to this.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Sydney on a point of order and will state the point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, it's on relevance because there is an
member for Sydney will
email
resume
and
her
letter
seat.
that—
The Prime Minister is being relevant to the question. No, you can't seek leave to table when you've risen on a point of order. You can seek leave to table at the conclusion of the question. The Prime Minister, the answer, I should say. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we are delivering over the decade 75% increase in funding. We are delivering for government schools 20% of the schooling resource standard right across the nation, because, of course, these government schools, the primary funder is the state or territory government. And for non-government schools, we're delivering 80% of the schooling resource standard, adjusted in accordance with their SES, and, of course, added to with loadings for various matters, disabilities, low socio-economic background, English as a second language, indigeneity and so forth. So it is a very thorough model. Now, the question for the Labor Party is this. If they say more money needs to be spent, are they saying that the federal government should pay a larger share of government schools' costs or of non-government schools' costs? Are they saying the schooling resource standard is not high enough or the loadings are not high enough? Because it's got to be one of those. So Labor needs a policy. 27 secret deals, 27 secret betrayals of Gonski's vision is not a policy, it's an embarrassment.
Just before I call the member for Sydney, the member for Ballarat is warned, and the member for Sydney is seeking leave to table the document. I understand.
I am, Mr Speaker. I'm seeking leave to table this email that went to every principal in New South Wales saying you can't trust the Liberals on education.
Granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Sydney will resume her seat. The member for Banks has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's fair and fully funded budget is delivering opportunity and security for 24 million Australians, including those in my electorate of Banks?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. And I know that in his electorate of Banks and in the electorates of all honourable members, there are many parents with children who are disabled, who are grateful that at long last the parliament appears to be on the point of honouring the commitment to the National Disability Insurance Scheme and fully fund it. And that is what we're doing. The Labor government left the insurance scheme, the disability insurance scheme, unfunded. We are rising to the challenge and ensuring it is funded. Mr Speaker, and I ask one question for the opposition leader. Will Labor support the increase in the Medicare levy to fully fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme? Because, Mr Speaker, it was only a few years ago when Labor increased the Medicare levy to partially fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the Leader of the Opposition, in a passionate call for bipartisanship, said no one could be that dumb to put politics before this critical reform. And the question is, will he play politics on this reform? The member for Warringah, at the time the NDIS was announced, as leader of the coalition, said this is a reform whose time has come. And now the time has come to pay for it. The time has come to fund it. The time has come to be fair and honest to all Australians and recognise that we should put the money backing that important policy, that important insurance scheme. And, Mr Speaker, it is fair, vitally fair, to be able to say to all Australian school students, you will receive Commonwealth funding consistently, fairly and based on needs. Right? Totally transparent. Everything disclosed. Not 27 secret deals conflicting with children in one part of the country receiving less than children in another. Totally transparent. And again, it is fair and honest to fully fund and guarantee Medicare, to restore indexation and to create a Medicare guarantee fund so that every year from the 1st of July all Australians will see, in priority, the monies are placed in that fund to fund Medicare and the PBS. And again, we ask whether the Leader of the Opposition will support that measure. Will he do that? After all, he talks a lot about Medicare. Will he back our fairness, our support for the NDIS, for a fair schools policy and for the guarantee of Medicare?
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Just this morning, the Treasurer reintroduced a bill to give big business a handout. Can the Prime Minister please tell Australians what is the updated cost of the government's full 10-year company tax cut?
Members on my right, the Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question, because it brings to mind another important matter that he should note for his stirring address tonight, and that is this, that the tax cuts for small and medium business, which employ collectively nearly half of all of the Australian private sector employees, those taxes are at law. They've been passed. And they cost over the 10 years $24 billion, around half of the total enterprise tax plan. So is the Leader of the Opposition, having spent that $24 billion, is he going tonight to say that he will repeal it? Is he going to say to all those hard-working, family-owned businesses, the Labor Party is going to increase tax on you? Is he going to say to them, as they take the incentive and the encouragement to invest and employ, is he going to say, oh, that tax cut was a handout? Note the language, Mr Speaker. It's very insightful. He says a tax cut is a handout. What that means is the Leader of the Opposition's view is that every dollar earned by a business actually belongs to the government, and such portion as the government allows the business to retain is a handout.
The
Speaker,
Prime
Mr.
Minister
Speaker.
will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The question specifically asking for a 10-year costing on a bill that was introduced to the parliament today.
The Leader of the House will cease interjecting.
The question asks quite specifically about a costing on their own legislation, an updated costing for the House. It's a reasonable question and he should be relevant to it.
I thank the Manager of Opposition Business for his point of order. It was a short question and it did specifically ask, as he says, it did have a short preamble to it as well, and the Prime Minister is on the policy topic of the question, which the Manager of Opposition Business acknowledged is my consistent ruling on listening closely to the Prime Minister, but he is in order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I regret the honourable member was not listening closely, because had he been so, he would recall that I said that the tax cuts for business enterprise tax cuts already passed have a 10-year cost of $24 billion, which I said was around half of the total package, and I'm reminded by the Treasurer the second part of the package would have a 10-year cost of $26 billion. So it is around half of the $50 billion package. But, Mr. Speaker, the fundamental point is this, that if we want to ensure that our children and our grandchildren have jobs, if we want to ensure that our businesses can compete, if we want to be sure that people will invest in Australian businesses, then we must have a competitive tax rate. Now, nobody has more eloquently spoken of the need for this than the Leader of the Opposition when he said a lower company tax rate means more investment, more productivity, more employment. So motivated and inspired by this eloquence was the member for McMahon that he wrote a whole book about it. And the fact is, the Labor Party cannot be trusted on this or any other issue. They promise to do one thing and they do the reverse, just like they promise to fight for the school kids' bonus every day to the election. Well, they abandoned it just before the election, as we remember. And they abandoned their commitment to tax reform. They abandoned their commitment to investment, to employment, to Australian workers, just as the Leader of the Opposition used to sell his own members down the river when he was running the AWU.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Barara has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House the right choices the government is making with respect to future taxpayers and ensure the government lives within its means?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and his keen interest, because he knows, like all members on this side of the House, how important it is for a government to live within its means. When we came to office, we inherited a debt that was growing at 3 times the rate that it is today because of the actions of this government. We inherited expenditure which was growing at some 3.5% more, and as a government we've been continuing to be able to ensure that that growth in expenditure retains a level of less than 2%. Less than 2%, which is a prudent thing to do in terms of constraining expenditure. A strong fiscal outlook provides a strong foundation for our nation's finances to be able to guarantee the services that Australians rely on and to give us the ability to absorb future shocks when and where they may come from, Mr. Speaker. So as a result of the budget that we've handed down on the fiscal side of the equation, Australia continues to be in a better position as a result of the strong economic and financial management of the Turnbull government. We have legislated and implemented some $25 billion worth of additional budget improvements since the last election. Measures that those opposite opposed, Mr. Speaker. It included those measures they opposed, and, Mr. Speaker, in this budget, as you know, we started from a point where we were $13.5 billion behind because of the constant obstruction and frustration of our measures to get expenditure even further under control by those who sit opposite. So we have been in a position to, despite the obstruction of those opposite, as they jeer and sneer and carry on with their usual political games, we have not been distracted from the task that we have. The task that we have is to bring that budget back to balance, and it remains projected to be in balance by 2021. But by the year 2018-19, we will be in a position where the government is no longer borrowing to pay for everyday expenditure. The Treasurer hasn't been able to say that for a decade.
Member for
Mr. Speaker.
Chifley.
And it's very important that the government, when it borrows for important new infrastructure. And it also borrows, in this case, when you look at over the medium term, to ensure that we do not touch and draw down from the Future Fund, Mr. Speaker. Our decision not to draw down on the Future Fund and to ensure we meet those unfunded superannuation liabilities, which will be done through the borrowings because we will borrow at a lesser rate than the Future Fund is earning for this country. That means that while the gross debt over the next 10 years will be higher for that reason, Mr. Speaker, we are not drawing down on that Future Fund, which will save taxpayers literally for a century. For ensuring that we protect the Future Fund. If those opposite had been elected at the last election, they would have raided the Future Fund like bandits.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Given the additional budget year, what is the updated cost of the Prime Minister's full 10-year company tax cut? And is the Prime Minister asserting it is still $26 billion?
The Treasurer. Members on my left. Treasurer has the call.
I confirm the answer the Prime Minister gave previously in relation to the original plan, Mr. Speaker, and the full cost is 36.5 from 1 July 17.
No, it's the independent question. Member for North Sydney can resume his seat. The member for Indi has the call.
My question's to the Prime Minister.
The member for Indi will resume her seat. The member for McMahon is warned. The Manager of Opposition Business will cease interjecting. The member for Indi has the call and she's entitled to ask her question. The member for Indi.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, I'd like to congratulate you and your government on the significant investment in rail infrastructure and your commitment to the $100 million upgrade to the North East Victorian line in the budget. And my community, led by the Hume Corridor Rail Group and the Border Rail Action Group, have lobbied long and hard for this. But they are eager to know, will this funding mean the end of the blame game? The success of this project is dependent on strong collaboration between all levels of government. My request, Prime Minister, will you please lead this collaboration, call together all the stakeholders so that the communities of North East Victoria will actually receive faster, more reliable rail services sooner rather than later.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for a question. I want to acknowledge her advocacy and also the advocacy of my colleagues, the member for Farrer just across the border, and of course the member for Murray and the member for Mallee, and all of our Victorian MPs, senators, who have campaigned so hard to see this substantial infrastructure investment in the honourable member's state. Now, Mr. Speaker, as part of a $500 million regional rail package for Victoria, my government has committed $100 million to upgrade the North East line running from Melbourne to Albury. My government has listened to the concerns of communities in Seymour, Benalla, Euroa, Wangaratta, Wodonga and Albury, and the coalition has delivered. Now, we know that people want to use the rail more but don't because it's unreliable. We know that the trains go slower than they should because the track is ageing and needs repair, and we know that communities want more frequent services. Our $100 million will fix the track. We'll re-sleeper, make drainage improvements and other track enhancements to improve the reliability of services and remove speed restrictions. The Minister will be there over the next month talking to communities about the project and how to make this important upgrade a reality as quickly as possible. Now, the investment will grow the region, the honourable member's region, better connect people to those towns and centres, to jobs, services and opportunities. They'll be able to make a doctor's appointment in Melbourne reliably, on time, and they'll be able to catch the train to the footy, knowing they'll be there in time for the kick-off. We're also providing $8.4 billion into the ARTC to build the Brisbane to Melbourne Inland Rail project that will also benefit the communities along the North East line. The Inland Rail will improve the national land freight network, reducing transport costs for farmers in Indi and Murray, linking those regions to all of the opportunities of domestic and international markets. It will take thousands of trucks off the roads, making all of our highways, and in particular the streets of Indi and surrounding areas, safer. Now, we're doing more to ensure, as the honourable member is well aware, the benefits of growth are shared in her electorate. Our regional jobs and investment package is helping regions diversify their economies and grow sustainable employment, including $20 million in the Goulburn Valley. We've also committed $10 million to road upgrades in Indi, and as a telecommunications enthusiast, the honourable member delighted to be reminded that we're rolling out 38 mobile phone towers in Indi, and there are more than 57,000 premises in Indi that can access the NBN. So our record investments in her electorate and in all honourable members' electorate are creating jobs, growing the economy, and in particular growing regional economies. And you don't need to look further than regional Australia to see our commitment to jobs and growth.
Concluded. The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House the right choices the government is making to ensure the Australian economy continues to grow to secure more and better paid jobs?
The member for McEwen will cease interjecting. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for North Sydney for his question. On budget night, I announced the additions to our National Economic Plan to drive jobs and growth in this country, and it's going to support more and better paid jobs because of the growth plan that this government has been pursuing, the growth plan that was endorsed at the last election and the growth plan that we have been implementing as a government. 160,000 full-time jobs in the last 6 months in the most recent data, Mr Speaker, and this government is committed to the growth that delivers more and better paid jobs. Adding to that growth story, and that includes by investing $75 billion in infrastructure that boosts the Australian economy right across the country, whether it's in regional Australia or in our major capital cities, whether it's runways or whether it's roads or whether it's rail, Mr Speaker. This is a government that's investing in nation-building infrastructure, including investing in energy infrastructure such as the national landmark of nation-building infrastructure, the Snowy Scheme 2.0. And we continue to invest in our defence industry plan. Our defence industry plan, Mr Speaker, some $90 billion in a naval shipbuilding program, which, when those opposite were on this side of the House, they couldn't even build a boat in a bathtub, Mr Speaker, because they couldn't even bring themselves to procure anything when it came to naval shipbuilding. And we're backing in small business, Mr Speaker, backing in small business again with the instant asset write-off, giving them a tax cut. And the question for the opposition leader tonight is he going to increase taxes on small business by reversing the business tax cut for small and medium-sized businesses tonight? Because if he doesn't do that, Mr Speaker, if he doesn't do that, he's staring at a $25 billion black hole over the next 10 years, which means once again we know that whatever he promises, he can never pay for it. Just like it was when they were in government before. They would make these big promises about big spending with no dollars behind them. It is a cruel and vicious hoax. And, Mr Speaker, we have already delivered tax cuts for businesses up to a turnover of $50 million. That is 3.2 million businesses. That is 6.5 million working Australians who are now working for businesses that are under the burden and will be under the burden of a lower tax rate as a result of the decisions, the right choices that have been made by this government to secure the better days ahead. And it is true today that we have reintroduced the remainder of our enterprise tax plan. And yes, at a cost of $35.6 billion over the next 10 years, Mr Speaker. And that is an investment in Australia. Because we know if we can lower the tax rate, that will draw the investment into this country, something those opposite used to believe in. I know the only two people—
The Treasurer's time has concluded. Members on my left, the member for Perth and the member for Chifley. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. I have twice asked the cost of the 10-year company tax cut. Initially, the Prime Minister said an extra $26 billion, and the Treasurer said $36.5 billion. Given that $10.5 billion was added from one answer to the next, how much is this government actually planning to give away to big business? What is the total cost of corporate tax cuts from the 1st of July 2017, both legislated and proposed to be legislated by this government?
The member for Grey will cease interjecting. The Treasurer has the call.
$65.4 billion.
The member for Durack. Members on my right. The member for Durack has the call.
Thank you, Speaker.
No, the Treasurer will resume his seat. Members on both sides, members on my left. Members on my left are delaying question time. No, I've called the next question. Okay. Members on my left, I will have no choice, being as even-tempered as I can be, but I will lower the volume by lowering the number of people in the House of Representatives. To the Treasurer, once you've sat down, once you hit the bench, that's it. The member for Durack has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health.
Member for Durack, resume her seat. Member for Durack can resume her seat. The member for McMahon and the member for Morton will leave under 94A. The member for Durack has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister outline the government's commitment to the mental health of all Australians? In particular, how is the government taking action to make sure that Australians receive the essential mental health care that they need?
The Minister for Health and Sport.
Good Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Durack, who has been a passionate advocate for extension of mental health services through rural telehealth to the members of her great electorate. As part of that process, the government committed in the budget to extend— this is about mental health services, please. As part of that process, the government committed $9 million to the extension of rural health services through telehealth and mental health to those people in rural Australia. In addition to that, mental health is something that I believe brings together people on all sides of this chamber. There are 4 million Australians, people in every electorate, in every corner of the country, who suffer from mental health issues: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, bipolar, manic depression, and most tragically often ending in suicide, with 3,000 losses a year. As part of that, we've seen the support over many years from different ministers, such as the member for Sturt and the member for Port Adelaide, in a bipartisan fashion for mental health services. This budget continues that tradition with a commitment of $173 million for extension and expansion of mental health services. We've seen $11 million for prevention of suicide at suicide hotspots, something which the Prime Minister himself championed, given the tragic experiences in his own electorate. In addition to that, there's $15 million for mental health research targeted at different states, beginning with Victoria and the work of Pat McGorry and Origin, looking at youth mental health services, $5 million with the Black Dog Institute and the Hunter Institute in New South Wales, and in Queensland, in the member for Fairfax's electorate, what we've seen with the Thompson Institute and Sunshine Coast University is additional funding there for anxiety and depression in the youth community. In particular, we've seen through the Veterans Health Package $58 million announced for looking at veterans' suicide and assisting in preventing that terrible scourge. And perhaps most significantly in this budget, we've provided $80 million for addressing psychosocial services outside of the NDIS. This will go to ensuring that there are stronger community support services for those who face the challenge of psychosocial conditions, which means that they cannot simply function on a day-to-day basis. The NDIS has been fully funded. Outside of the NDIS, now we've committed $80 million to support mental health services, to assist those who would otherwise be suffering, and we're doing it on the basis of matched contribution and funding from the states. This is an important topic that touches every member and every family, and I am delighted that this budget, under the leadership of the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, continues in the past traditions.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government has just announced a $65.4 billion handout to business, including big business. How are you going to pay for it?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'll firstly clear up what appeared to be some confusion on the other side. The government's 10-year enterprise tax plan began last year. It began on the 1st of July 2016, and the cost over 10 years.
For Port Adelaide.
The cost over 10 years is, as I described, $50 billion, of which a little less than half, $24 billion, is the cost of the legislated saves, that is legislated reductions, that is companies with a turnover of less than $50 million, and the balance of around $26 billion is for the larger companies that are unlegislated. In terms of 10 years from 1st of July 2017, the cost is $65 billion, of which around $29.5 billion are for the legislated saves already, for reductions, for savings for business, cost of the budget, but legislated reductions, and $35 billion for the balance. So that's to be very clear.
Members
the
on my
answer
left.
I gave was absolutely correct. It is a 10-year enterprise tax plan, and it begins on the 1st of July last year.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. Before I call the Leader of the Opposition, I'll do it now to you. Leave under 94A, member for Wakefield. Yep. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
It's relevant. My question was, how is the Prime Minister going to pay for the $65.5 billion corporate tax giveaway?
His seat. The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, all of the costs of the reductions in company tax are fully funded and set out in the budget. They are fully funded. The budget goes into surplus
Manager of Opposition
in
Business.
2020, 2021 and remains there over the medium term. That is all set out in the budget papers, and honourable members know it. So unlike the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which the honourable members opposite did not fund, we are funding the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we're funding our educational commitments, we're funding the guarantee of Medicare, and we are funding a reduction in company tax, and we are doing that because we know Australian companies have to be competitive. And the fact of the matter is, if honourable members seriously think Australian business can compete with a tax rate of 30% when other comparable countries are at 20% or 18%, or in terms of the United States heading to 15%, they are dreaming. Australian businesses need to be competitive. They need the incentives to invest. They need the incentives to employ. The cost of the company tax cuts are fully calculated, fully taken into account. They are vital. Those cuts are vital to retain the competitiveness of Australian business, Australian workers, ensure they get the investment and the jobs they need.
The member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister update the House on defence spending in the 2017-2018 budget And how will this budget assist the growth of the Australian defence industry and supply chain which support and create jobs in my electorate of Leichhardt and for many other hard-working Australians?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question. The member for Leichhardt represents Cairns, as you would know, Mr Speaker, and he has done a terrific job advocating for Cairns in the defence space, for defence industry, particularly in shipping and sustainment and maintenance for the patrol vessels. And next week, in fact, the Defence Roadshow comes to Cairns, being run by the Defence Department, of course, to explain to businesses in Cairns how they can get more involved in the global supply chain of these large primes and companies that are setting up in Australia, how they can interact better with defence in order to create jobs, grow their businesses, improve their investments and take part in what is essentially a renaissance in defence industry in this country as a result of the Turnbull government's decisions in defence. Now, before we came to power, Mr Speaker, Labor had reduced defence spending to 1.56% of GDP. As I've said before, the lowest level since 1938, the years of appeasement. In this budget, Mr Speaker, that the Treasurer handed down on Tuesday, we will hit 2% of GDP as a share of the GDP of defence funding in 2020, 3 years earlier than we promised at the 2013 election. 3 years earlier. It's going to go very quiet when we actually start telling the facts about their record versus our record, Mr Speaker. In 2013, we promised it would be 2023, it will be 2020, that our share of spending on defence as a percentage of GDP will hit 2%. In fact, it will exceed 2%. And this year's budget is laid out that we are increasing military capability, the largest increase in our peacetime history, by $200 billion over the course of the next decade. The member for Eden Monaro likes to interject. He was part of a government that didn't make one decision to build a ship in Australia in 6 years. Not one, and we are building 54. He should be ashamed to be a member of the Labor Party that reduced our defence spending so dramatically. In the next 12 months, Mr Speaker, we intend to do a number of very important milestones. In the third quarter of this year, we'll choose the combat management system for our new future frigates. The preferred tenderer for the offshore patrol vessels will be announced in the next few months. That will be chosen, starting at Osborne and then moving to Henderson. The preferred design of the 9 future frigates, a $35 billion program, will be decided in the next 12 months, early next year, and we expect to make the decision about which company will build the iconic combat reconnaissance vehicles known as the Land 400 project. All of these decisions, we are ahead of schedule, Mr Speaker, ahead of schedule, creating jobs, encouraging investment, bringing businesses to Australia. Businesses like Morand and Victoria are benefiting through the Joint Strike Fighter program, Taylor Brothers in Tasmania. The list is endless, Mr Speaker, and it's just good news.
The member for Chifley is warned. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today, just in question time, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer have said the cost of its 10-year corporate tax cut is $26 billion, $36.5 billion. Then it was $35.6 billion, then $65.4 billion. And in their latest answer, it was back at $35 billion. Prime Minister, how much will the 10-year figure cost taxpayers at the next election?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, what that question reveals is the Leader of the Opposition's persistent, desperate manner of misrepresenting everything that he's been told. He asked
Member
me,
for Jagga.
he asked me what the cost of the 10-year enterprise tax plan was from its beginning, from 2016. It began in 2016. Then he asked what it cost
and the member
10
for
years
Parramatta.
from 2017. In each case, he was given the accurate answer. Now, the fact of the matter is this. That there are, over the first 10 years of the enterprise tax plan, which began at the beginning of the current financial year, the cost to the budget of the legislated cuts is about $24 billion. And the question is, let's legislate. Now, tonight, is the Leader of the Opposition going to announce that those reductions in company tax for small and medium companies will be repealed? That's the first question. That's the first question. Because they employ collectively around half of the private sector workforce. And those workers depend on their businesses investing and growing and employing. Now, he's going to have to tell us whether he's going to repeal those legislated tax cuts. And the reality is, Mr. Speaker, that to remain competitive, we need to have a competitive company tax regime. All of our tax changes are fully funded and fully costed and set out in the budget. They are all there, unlike Labor's, and by 2020-21, we are in surplus to the tune of $7.4 billion. So that's why our budget is fair. It's fair to Australian workers. It's fair to Australians facing disabilities. It's fair to Australians needing to have their guarantee of Medicare and the PBS. It's fair to school children who need to be assured that Commonwealth funding is needs-based, fair, consistent and equitable right across the nation. And it is fair to build the infrastructure we need for the 21st century and to do all that and live within our means and not throw a mountain of debt, as Labor would, on the shoulders of our children and grandchildren. That is the big difference. This is a fair budget. It's a responsible budget. It delivers the economic growth. It delivers the opportunity. It delivers the security that Australians deserve.
Just before I call the member for Dunkley, I'd just like to recognise in the Southern Gallery the Rotary Adventure in Citizenship, students from right across Australia who've been in Canberra all of this week, and welcome them on behalf of all members. The member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister update the House on the government's investment in major projects right across the country? How is the government's $75 billion infrastructure package going to boost productivity and increase livability in our states and territories, including in my electorate of Dunkley?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, I do thank the member for Dunkley, who has a strong interest in infrastructure, and I well remember being with him to announce a $4 million commitment for a study into the electrification of the Frankston line. And with his commitment to infrastructure, he will welcome the $75 billion commitment to infrastructure spending in this budget, an infrastructure package that delivers benefits for our nation. In Western Australia, a $2.3 billion package, including nearly $800 million for the Thornley and Yanchep line extensions, subject to business cases being assessed by Infrastructure Australia. A $1 billion package in Victoria, including over $500 million for regional rail, including the Geelong line, $30 million for a business case into a rail connection between the Melbourne City and Tullamarine Airport. If there's rail from the City of Sydney to Sydney Airport, from the City of Brisbane to Brisbane Airport, if there's rail being built from Perth to Perth Airport, then a city like Melbourne, a major city, deserves a rail connection to the airport. And that's why we've committed $30 million for business case funding for this project. A national government committing to national infrastructure projects, including $8.4 billion for the Inland Rail. And a national
Minister for Urban Infrastructure will resume his seat. The member for Lyons on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. On relevance, the minister's talking about infrastructure for the national program, but he hasn't mentioned Tasmania.
The member for Lyons will resume his seat. It's a frivolous point of order. If he repeats it, he'll be ejected from the chamber. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A $10 million national rail program, with money starting to flow from 2019-20, recognising that in our major cities around Australia there are rail projects which have the capacity to move people more efficiently and quickly and are city-shaping. This is a major commitment to Australia's cities and to their surrounding regional areas. And of course, Mr Speaker, Western Sydney Airport, $5.3 billion equity commitment for a project which stayed in the too hard basket for too long. This government is committing to build Western Sydney Airport with a $5.3 billion equity commitment. Mr Speaker, you are seeing a significant shift to a greater use of equity and loan investment in this budget, in our approach to infrastructure, and you're seeing a commitment to national priorities that no one state government can deliver, such as the Inland Rail running right along the eastern seaboard through Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, running inland and supporting a mode shift in freight from road to rail. National infrastructure priorities being delivered in this $75 billion infrastructure spend.
The minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
To the Prime Minister, my question is just about this $65.4 billion 10-year big business handout. Prime Minister, how much will flow to overseas shareholders?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, to deal with some of the matters, including the ones raised by the Leader of the Opposition. The government's tax plan, which delivers the incentive in our economy for businesses to invest, including attracting foreign capital to invest in the country, which deals with the matter the member opposite has risen, is also subject over the medium term to a tax to GDP cap of 23.9%. So, Mr Speaker, what I'm suggesting to the opposition in how this measure is funded is that our government is also committed over the medium term to ensuring that our tax to GDP remains below 23.9%. But the question the opposition leader has to answer tonight is, will he commit to the same thing, Mr Speaker? Or will he allow taxes as a share of the economy to grow and grow and grow and grow? And he's already spoken, Mr Speaker, on the subject of tax which he has raised. On the subject of tax he has raised in his question.
Interjecting.
On tax issues he has raised in his question, Mr Speaker. He has also made some bleatings about the deficit levy, Mr Speaker. And I remind the Leader of the Opposition that he said, and I particularly remind the Shadow Treasurer on this issue.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. Just before I recognise the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Sydney on cue interjects. Those interjecting, those who interject persistently, are going to be dealt with. I've given fair warning. A couple have gone already. Don't be surprised if you interject and you're out of the chamber straight away. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, I just simply ask the Prime Minister or the Treasurer, in fact anyone over there, if they could answer it, how much of the $65 billion corporate tax rate is going to foreign shareholders, full stop?
Just before I call the Treasurer, I point out to the Leader of the Opposition, as I have to many making points of order on relevance, the question had a preamble. It did have a specific question. The Treasurer is on the policy topic. He's in order. The questioner cannot demand that the minister answering the question answer it in the way they'd like them to, but he's on the policy topic and he has the call.
So I thank you, Mr Speaker. So the Leader of the Opposition needs to confirm, will they commit to the 23.9% tax to GDP cap? Will he confirm, will he reverse $29.8 billion in small and medium businesses' tax cuts? Will he reverse that and increase taxes on small businesses tonight, and as a result cost jobs in small business around the country, Mr Speaker? And will he go back, and in particular will the Shadow Treasurer go back on his word when he said in relation to cutting the personal income tax rates that were put up with the deficit levy in 14-15, he said, we don't like it, we don't support it. He said Paul Keating started the process of reducing those marginal tax rates to make us more competitive as a nation in a globalised world. That's the direction we should be heading in. So the question for the Leader of the Opposition tonight is he going to go in the opposite direction that Paul Keating said the country should go in? He's already said on company tax they want to go in a different direction than the one Paul Keating said they should go in. And tonight, is he going to commit to lower taxes, Mr Speaker, or do what the Labor Party always does and jack up taxes? There are only two groups that seem to be unhappy, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the government's budget: the Labor Party and the big banks.
The member for Dawson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the government is supporting jobs in regional Australia, particularly the agricultural sector? And is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any threats to existing and future jobs in regional Australia, particularly in my electorate of Dawson?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. As we know, we have substantial investment in regional Australia. The Inland Rail, $8.4 billion to make sure that we can move the product around. That is part of a nation that has increased its agricultural production by 31% since the coalition government's been in power, part of a coalition government that has seen 23.7% growth in agricultural production to December last year, part of a coalition government that has seen free trade agreements with Korea, China and Japan. But he also asked the question about if there's any threats to any further jobs, especially in regional areas such as Dawson, and we have one. Indigenous land use agreements. Indigenous land use agreements have been deemed by a court case in Western Australia to be not be able to be upheld unless they have a unanimous decision against all participants, which is completely different to what the democratic process is of having a majority decision. And this is something that we know that everybody believes is unfeasible and we have to get changed. In fact, we've seen even statements by the Leader of the Opposition that clearly states that they don't believe in this and that legislation has to go through to redeem this situation and to make sure that we go into bat for the steel workers at Arium, for the coal miners of Central Queensland, because we believe in coal mines. But what is happening instead is we can all hang around tonight to listen to the Leader of the Opposition babble on. We can all listen to him, but what the people in Central Queensland want to hear, what the coal miners want to hear, what the steel workers at Arium want to hear, is that you will resolve this issue in regards to Indigenous land use agreements. You can do it right now. Today, in the chamber and in the other place, they've had a vote for extension of hours, and the Labor Party is doing everything in their power to stop helping labourers, The labourers want to go to work on Friday, but the Labor Party doesn't. The labourers want to go to work on Friday, but the Labor Party doesn't. They don't want to stand up for the steel workers. They don't want to stand up for the coal miners. They don't believe in coal mining anymore. So much so that we have the Australian Workers Union that is leaving you. They're leaving the Australian Labor Party because the Australian Workers Union realised the Australian Labor Party does not believe in labourers anymore. There's no longer a belief in labourers. And what does the member for Hunter do? Is he standing up for his coal miners? No. What does the member for Shortland do? Is he standing up for his coal miners? No. What does the Leader of the Labor Party do? No, turn around, old Trout. Turn around and have a listen. Are you going to stand up for your labourers? Are you going to stand up for the people of Central Queensland?
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for McEwen is now warned. Manager of Opposition Business on a point
Don't really have a point of order. I just thought you need to take a breath. So.
The Deputy Prime Minister will not seek to instruct me from the front bench. He is warned. The Manager of Opposition Business will need to leave under 94A. Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, and I accept your admonishment, Mr Speaker. But the question is for whether the Leader of the Labor Party tonight is going to stand up for labourers. Is he going to stand up for farmers? Is he actually going to stand up for the steel workers at Arium? Because he hasn't stood up for them today. He has left them hanging today. He will not go back to work on Friday for the steel workers. He will not go back to work on Friday for the coal miners. He does not believe in labourers anymore in the Labor Party.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. In the answer to the same question, the government has given 5 different answers to the full updated cost of its big business handout. My question is, why didn't any of these numbers appear in the budget papers or the Treasurer's speech on Tuesday night?
The Prime Minister has the call. Leader of the House will cease interjecting.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition thinks he can get away with this consistent misrepresentation of everything. He will not stick to a promise. There is not a word he won't break. There's not a statement he won't misrepresent. The Treasurer and I have accurately described the 10-year cost of the enterprise tax plan from 2016, which is when it began, and then the Treasurer updated that for a decade from 1 July 2017. But it is a 10-year enterprise tax plan which is in operation and began on the 1st of July last year. So the answer I gave was absolutely accurate and consistent with what the government has produced. And the Leader of the Opposition's pathetic attempt to misrepresent this, it is pathetic. It is so desperate. The real issue here is, do you want Australia to be competitive or not? Do you want Australian businesses to invest? And do, I dare say, Mr Speaker, do you want foreign investors to invest in Australia? Because we are a massive importer of capital. And if we do not have a competitive tax rate, then we will not see investment in Australia. We will lose jobs. We will lose opportunities. And Mr Speaker, the sheer hypocrisy of the Labor Party on this point, the attempt by the Leader of the Opposition to deny everything he stood for in the past. This is a man who said in 2011 cutting the company income tax rate increases domestic productivity and domestic investment. More capital means higher productivity and economic growth and leads to more jobs and higher wages. Well, what's changed in the last 6 years?
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order, he'll simply state the point of order. The Leader of the House.
Relevance. Oh, sorry.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My point of order is on relevance. I simply asked, where does the $65.4 billion any figure appear in the budget?
His seat. The Prime Minister is completely in order, and I caution the Leader of the Opposition. He has latitude as a leader, he knows that, but I've said to him on a number of occasions it is not an opportunity to repeat the question. The Prime Minister is completely in order and he has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The budget is presented both with the forward estimates, the 4-year forward estimates and the medium-term projections consistent with the practice of many years, and the honourable member understands that. The fact is, Mr Speaker, that the honourable member, the Leader of the Opposition, is attempting now to eat every single word he has ever uttered when he was in government about company tax. This is a man who said, "Friends," he said, "friends, corporate tax reform helps Australia's private sector grow. It creates jobs right up and down the income ladder." And of course, his colleague, the member for McMahon, said it's a Labor thing to have the ambition of reducing company tax because it promotes investment, creates jobs and drives growth. And he said in 2013 our company tax rate is now above the OECD average at 30%. It's how the rate compares to that of our competitors that counts. Now, that was true in 2013. It's even more true in 2017, and it will be even more true in the years to come. The truth is, Mr Speaker, we need to allow our businesses to compete, and they need a competitive tax rate to invest.
The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Justice, representing the Attorney-General. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is securing Australia's economic future by making changes to the Native Title Act? How will these amendments create jobs and opportunity for Australia while giving certainty to native title rights holders?
The Minister for Justice has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Capricornia for that question and her interest in this issue. And as the Deputy Prime Minister has outlined, Indigenous land use agreements provide job opportunities, infrastructure and economic development for hundreds of thousands of Indigenous Australians, and they also facilitate vitally important projects which create thousands of jobs for the wider community. We remain firmly committed to Indigenous land use agreements, but a recent decision in the McGlade decision by the Federal Court has resulted in massive uncertainty throughout Australia for all native title and industry stakeholders. This uncertainty will affect at least 126 Indigenous land use agreements, creating continued uncertainty for tens of thousands of our fellow Australians. Now, it is absolutely vital that this parliament move quickly to protect the opportunities and the projects that are made possible by the ILUA system, and it's absolutely vital that this is done in a timely manner. Just to give you an example from my home state of Western Australia of what is at stake here, the agreement which the court decision related to was a single Noongar settlement which has put at risk $1.3 billion in benefits to 30,000 Noongar people across Western Australia. And this is opportunity that this community needs. Now, we've introduced, to deal with this, urgent amendments to the Native Title Act to resolve the legal uncertainty that has been created by the courts. This uncertainty can only be resolved by the expeditious passage of this bill through the parliament. And we provided the Senate with the opportunity this morning to pass this bill quickly, to pass this bill this week. What we asked was for the Senate to sit until this bill passed so we can resolve the uncertainty for literally hundreds of thousands of Australians and members of the Indigenous communities around the country. Now, the Labor Party has said that they will support our changes to this bill, and every significant stakeholder is urging this parliament to take action, including the Queensland Labor government, who's written to the Prime Minister begging him to take immediate action to deal with this. Now, inexplicably, in the Senate today, Labor Party senators have refused to debate the bill this week. And what this means, because we've got Senate estimates intervening, is that the Senate will no longer be able to deal with this until the middle of June. So the billions of dollars in investment, the tens of thousands of jobs, the futures of Indigenous Australians all around the country remain in limbo because Labor Party senators refuse to work on Fridays. That's what's happening. Labor Party senators won't work till midday tomorrow, and as a result has created this future uncertainty for our fellow Australians. It's an absolute disgrace.
Concluded. The member for Rankin.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer advise the House what gross debt is projected to rise to in dollar terms by 2027-28?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer the member to page 79 of the statement, which says the total face value of Commonwealth Government securities on issue is projected to rise to $725 billion by 27-28. Mr Speaker, the face value of CGS on issue is projected to rise to a within-year peak of around $649 billion in 2021, which is what I confirmed to the House yesterday. And it's important to understand, Mr Speaker, on these figures, that from 2018-19 the Commonwealth will no longer be raising new debt, Mr Speaker, to pay for things that are everyday expenditure, because from 2018-19 the net debt peaks, Mr Speaker, and comes down, and I confirm that the net debt at the end of that period is projected to fall to 8.5% of GDP, or $255.8 billion. Mr Speaker, when the Howard Costello government paid back Labor's debt, they paid back the $96 billion in net debt, Mr Speaker. That was the debt, Mr Speaker, that was paid back by the Howard Costello government, and it was the former Treasurer, the member for Lilley, who began the process of revving the debt up again, Mr Speaker. So the debt we have inherited, Mr Speaker, which was growing at three times the rate, Mr Speaker, that it is now, we have been able to get that debt under control. And under the budget I announced on Tuesday night, the net debt will fall, Mr Speaker. It will fall to just 8.5% of GDP. And within 1 year from now, just over 1 year from now, the Commonwealth will no longer be paying for everyday expenditure by raising new debt. And importantly, around $85 billion of that debt that was referred to for the 725 is to ensure that we do not raid the Future Fund, and as a result, a century of taxpayers will not have to pay additional tax to meet our unfunded superannuation liabilities. And the other additional debt that is represented there is to pay for important infrastructure projects, Mr Speaker. Infrastructure which is building in our nation, and infrastructure which is growing our economy, and infrastructure is supporting more and better paid jobs. Now, if those opposite are the only debt that they are interested in was debt to put everyday expenses on the credit card. From 2018-19, the Turnbull government will not be doing that. The Turnbull government will be reducing our net debt, Mr Speaker, just like the Howard Costello government was doing, and we're doing it by keeping our expenditure under control to less than 2% of GDP. The rate of growth in gross debt has fallen by 2/3 under this government, Mr Speaker. This is a government that can be trusted with our nation's finances, and the member opposite needs to tell the Australian people how he's going to fund his empty promises. It's another cruel hoax on the Australian people.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The member for Bonner has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. How will the government's reform to skilled visas grow jobs in our economy?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. The hard work he does in his electorate supporting young people in particular into work, and at the heart of every decision, Mr Speaker, that this government makes, we want to support Australians into work. We want to make sure that we can help those young apprentices. We want to make sure that we can help people across society get a job, because that will provide a better future, not only for them but for their children and their families and our country as well. And, Mr Speaker, we announced the abolition of the 457 visa program, which had ballooned under Labor. Labor's dodgy 457 visa program saw all sorts of rorts and rackets presided over by the Leader of the Opposition when he was the then Employment Minister in the Rudd and Gillard governments. At the same time he was pretending to be a friend of the Australian worker, he was bringing foreign workers into our country in the tens of thousands. That's what this Leader of the Opposition did. And today, Mr Speaker, we see another demonstration of the slippery approach of this Leader of the Opposition, who will seek to misrepresent any fact, and that's what he did when he was a union leader as well. We know, Mr Speaker, that his dodgy approach to the truth hasn't started just today. We know that this has been a lifetime of practice by this Leader of the Opposition, and, Mr Speaker, it frustrates those people opposite, behind him. In particular, it frustrates the member for Grayndler. To a point, Mr Speaker, I think we need to watch the member for Grayndler over the coming few weeks. I think he's got his eye on this Leader of the Opposition. I think that's what's happening here, Mr Speaker. I think it's pretty obvious. What's going on here, Mr Speaker. He realises that this dodgy Leader of the Opposition can't be trusted by workers. He demonstrated that when he ripped off workers through dodgy union agreements. He demonstrated it when he was the Employment Minister, when he said to Australian workers, "I want to put you first." At the same time, he was doing deals with McDonald's and other employers to bring foreign workers into those jobs which should have been filled by Australian workers. And we see it time and time again in question time, as we saw demonstrated today, Mr Speaker. This budget is about getting more jobs and supporting Australian businesses to employ more Australian workers. We support small business through tax cuts because we want them to employ more workers. We want them to be profitable, to set up more businesses around the country, to provide support to local communities. That is what this government has done, and no words misconstrued by this Leader of the Opposition will change that outcome, Mr Speaker. The Australian public, just as workers and just as Labor members opposite have quickly worked out, they know what this Leader of the Opposition is about, and I predict this, Mr Speaker, he will not change his spots.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. If the deficit levy on high-income earners was necessary when the deficit for the coming year was $2.8 billion in Joe Hockey's first budget—
The member for Rankin will resume his seat. The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection is warned. I want to hear the member for Rankin ask his question without a barrage of interjections so I can hear it. Start again.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. If the deficit levy on high-income earners was necessary when the deficit for the coming year was $2.8 billion in Joe Hockey's first budget, why isn't it necessary when the deficit for the same year is $29.4 billion, or 10 times bigger, in this budget?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. When the temporary deficit levy was first proposed in 2014, honourable members opposite opposed it, root and branch. They described it as a deceit tax, said it was a shocking idea. They finally came around. They finally came around and voted for it on the basis that it would expire after 3 years. And now they are saying that in this budget we are abolishing the deficit levy. That's absolutely untrue. The deficit levy had a term of 3 years which expires on the 30th of June this year. So as a matter of principle, consistency and integrity, the opposition has to recognise that the deficit levy was one they opposed and denounced as a deceit. They then voted for it on the basis that it had a 3-year term, and now they want to make it permanent. Mr Speaker, the deficit levy raises around $1 billion a year, a little bit over $1 billion a year. It is no substitute for increasing the Medicare levy by 0.5%, which raises current numbers around $4 billion a year. It is not the answer to funding the NDIS, because simply there are not enough taxpayers earning over $180,000. There are 9 million plus tax filers in Australia. Around 700,000 file returns with incomes of $180,000 or more. So the temporary deficit levy, whatever its merits at the time, contested of course by the Labor Party, is not the answer to the long-term funding. Now, I want to make a point about the long-term funding of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, Mr Speaker, because this is related to the issue of fiscal viability. The Leader of the Opposition tonight will no doubt say that Labor will not proceed with the rest of the enterprise tax plan and claim that that will somehow or other enable them not to increase the Medicare levy. Let us be quite clear about this. Labor has already spent the proceeds of the enterprise tax plan. They've already spent every cent, and they were still $16.5 billion further in deficit. Important point. Second important point, Mr Speaker, is does anyone seriously imagine that in an environment where one country after another is reducing their corporate tax rate, that we will be able to have 10 years from now a company tax rate at 30%, perhaps double that of the United States? Is the Labor Party seriously want to put every Australian business out of business? The reality is we have to make our tax system competitive. Labor used to understand it.
The member for Wide Bay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the minister outline to the House how the government's $75 billion of infrastructure investment over a decade will benefit my electorate of Wide Bay and all of Australia, and are there any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Infrastructure and Transport.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Wide Bay. As a former police officer, he well understands the importance of investing in good infrastructure. He knows that good infrastructure will change people's lives, it will save people's lives, particularly on our roads. So I congratulate him for the work he's doing on behalf of his community. And, Mr Speaker, the government is investing $75 billion over 10 years in infrastructure across our nation. And I'm delighted to be the minister who's delivering this record infrastructure spend around our nation. And as part of the Turnbull-Joyce government, I want to congratulate congratulate the Prime Minister, congratulate the Deputy Prime Minister and the Treasurer for the budget they handed down this week, which will deliver right across Australia. And in relation to the member's own electorate, the Bruce Highway is an issue he's particularly focused on. This budget continues to deliver on our record $6.7 billion investment in the Bruce Highway over 10 years, and we're getting on with the job of delivering those projects right along the coast of Queensland. The member for Grayndler interjects, and Member Grayndler continues to interject and suggest that somehow we're spending less than he did on the Bruce Highway. But his own press release from April 24, 2013, the member for Grayndler's own press release, and I quote, "with his latest announcement taking our total commitment to this vital economic lifeline to $5.7 billion. That's $5.7 billion, a 10-year plan for a better, safer Bruce Highway. A 10-year plan. We have a 10-year plan. We're spending $6.7 billion, $1 billion more than the member for Grayndler ever intended to spend under his 10-year plan for the Bruce Highway." And the member for Wide Bay asked about projects in his own electorate, and the budget included $11.2 million for the Bruce Highway and Wide Bay Highway intersection, which he'll be very pleased about. It included $530 million for the Pine River to Caloundra upgrade. And I know the member for Petrie is very proud of that. The member for Fairfax, the member for Fisher, the member for Dixon, they're all very happy. The member for Longman, she's happy as well. The member for Longman's happy with the upgrade. On the other side, and of course the member for Petrie will be very excited about the $120 million for the Deception Bay interchange upgrade, which was also announced in the budget. And on top of that, Mr Speaker, there's $182 million for the Bruce Highway safety upgrade. And this week of all weeks, National Road Safety Week, that upgrade will help to save lives and reduce road trauma, which I'm sure all members join me in recognising. So, Mr Speaker, the Treasurer released a fair budget. It's a budget that will help to change lives and save lives with our infrastructure spend, and he's made the right choices. There's a lot more in this budget than perhaps those opposite have recognised yet. There's $20 billion for the rail program, $8.4 billion investment in inland rail. There's $10 billion in the National Rail Program, where we're working with the states to improve connectivity across our nation. There's more than $5 billion to deliver the much and long-awaited Western Sydney Airport. We are creating jobs right across Australia. We are delivering a safer, stronger, better Australia where everyone can get ahead, and we are building for our future while others are whinging about it.
The Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr Speaker, on indulgence and after speaking with the opposition leader, I want to note the passing today of Mark Colvin. Mark Colvin was as elegant as he was erudite, a prodigious reader. He was as well informed as all of us would like to be, and more so. He came to Australia from the United Kingdom, the son of an officer in MI6, so the son of a spy, and he displayed some of his father's adventurism, if you like, around the world in many dangerous places, over 40 years working for the ABC, interpreting the world and its most challenging environments, its most war-torn places for Australians. Of course, he understood geopolitics brilliantly, the politics of the Cold War in particular. He travelled and reported from Rwanda, where he became ill, seriously ill, and that illness affected him for the rest of his life, and as we know, caused him great pain and great suffering. But he was an inspiration in the way he dealt with his challenges, and he was a great advocate for and example of the importance of organ donation. He was truly heroic in that regard. But he was a gentle man, a calm man, an honest man, and somebody who spoke with a voice of well-informed authority into what is often a cacophony of spin and superficiality in 2017. He brought with him a breath, perhaps romantically from this perspective, of a more measured, better read, less chaotic, less vindictive world of journalism where there was a truly objective, well-thought-out voice. He will be sorely missed, Mr Speaker,
He'll be sorely missed, and I know that the Leader of the Opposition and I join with all honourable members in sending our deepest condolences to his family, particularly his mother, Anne, and his sons, William and Nicholas.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, on indulgence, and I want to thank the Prime Minister for his words. On behalf of the Labor Party and the Opposition, I wish to express our and my condolences to Mark Colvin's family and to his colleagues on his tragic passing today. Across 4 decades, across mediums and continents, I think we all agree that Mark Colvin was one of the finest minds in journalism. We use the word giants perhaps casually sometimes, but no one, I think, would dispute that he was a giant of journalism. From Canberra to London, Tehran, Rwanda, Belfast and Baghdad, Mark explained to Australians what we needed to know in a way only that he could do. I think most Australians would know Mark best through ABC's PM program. For 2 decades he had a calm and measured, mellifluous voice, which is with us in the cars as we drive home, keeping us company on an evening shift, perhaps in the kitchen as we would get dinner ready. He had a certain manner. There was a disarming mix of gentleness and authority. He could cajole the most skilled, recalcitrant non-answerers into finishing a sentence which passes through the mind of the interviewee, did I just say that? It is a loss to journalism, as the Prime Minister has said, but it's a loss to public discourse. It is a loss to national life. To his family, I say, most Australians will never know him in the way you did, but it's a remarkable gift to know someone through their voice alone. And through his voice and the capacity and his values, to be able to know a person, that I think is the mark of the person who has passed. I think his life was interesting, rewarding, colourful and challenging. His was a life worth living. He was a man worth knowing. Journalism's gentleman, a voice that we'll never forget. May he rest in peace.
The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I move that further statements on indulgence be permitted in the Federation.